This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us today on this Thursday's programming, we have K-State's AJ Tarpoff with advice regarding blue-green algae blooms that producers should be aware of during these hot summer months. He provides resources and management practices to help producers mitigate the risks associated with these toxic blooms. Also ahead, K-State's Phillip Lancaster provides cattle producers with the information they need to know about a new-to-the-market feed additive that helps reduce ammonia gas emissions in the feedlot. Finally, to round out today's programming, we have part 2 of our 2-part horticulture segments for the week from K-State's Dennis Patton on compost. That and more ahead on this Thursday's edition of Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. To start off this Thursday's programming, we have with us K-State's AJ Tarpoff, our beef extension veterinarian, to cover a topic that cattle producers with water reservoirs on their property might specifically want to keep in mind this time of year. He's going to be speaking on the risks associated with blue-green algae and cattle. AJ, thanks for joining us for this discussion today.
It's a pleasure to be here, and blue-green algae is the topic. And unfortunately, we have bright sunshiny days, we have warmer temperatures. That also brings the risk of developing some blue-green algae in some of our surface water, and especially livestock water ponds. We already here in Kansas have multiple warnings in some of the recreation reservoirs through the state, and that's really tracked heavily by KDHE, and they have those maps and warning maps available. But today we're really going to talk about the concerns with livestock. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, blue-green algae isn't even an algae. It's a cyanobacteria. So it's a bacteria that's photosynthetic and it's buoyant. So it actually floats just below the surface of the water. And it's naturally found in most of our water sources. Reservoirs, ponds, it's naturally found there. However, when conditions are right and the certain species of these cyanobacteria are there, they can develop what's called a harmful algae bloom. And it can happen overnight, happen suddenly. Their population just explodes, and all of a sudden we have this almost like paint-like consistency floating through the water source. And whenever you see it, it's uncanny, and it really jumps out at this very strange, either light green, blue-greenish colors. As it dies, it kind of turns brown, but it looks like almost oil floats on the water, except it's just below the water. So it's referred to as kind of a green paint-like consistency.
Hence the name.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. And obviously, you've mentioned that this poses a risk to our livestock. So what are some of those risks?
So the key risk with blue-green algae and consumption of and exposure of blue-green algae to our livestock is these specific cyanobacteria. They can release 2 different types of toxins, one of which is actually a neurotoxin. So it attacks the nervous system of cattle and livestock, and unfortunately, it's lethal. It doesn't take very much of that toxin that they consume, and all of a sudden, within minutes to hours, they can have clinical signs, they can be staggering around, ultimately leading to death. The other toxin that I mentioned is actually a hepatotoxin. It's a liver toxin. So it's specific to the liver that once they consume that toxin, it actually directly kills and damages the liver cells itself. So it really just depends on how much toxin they had, whether it's going to be lethal, whether we're going to have other debilitating liver issues kind of long term. But both of them are a major concern not just for livestock, but for people, for pets. Dogs swimming in some of those water sources can be very, very even deadly for some of the pets.
Sure. So with that in mind, producers are obviously going to want to be mindful of this. So when should they be mindful of this toxin really breaking out?
Since it's so sporadic, if you've had water sources that have had the issue in the past, is it 100% certainty it's going to happen again? No, not necessarily, but when the conditions are right, we have bright shiny skies, we have low wind speeds, we kind of have stagnant water. Those are prime conditions that can pop up essentially anywhere. So it's good to be mindful to constantly monitor some of these watering sources and ponds throughout the entire summer months, because we don't know when it'll pop up, but when it does, we need to make some management changes right away.
Absolutely. And if we're seeing some of these symptoms that you mentioned, what were those again?
So the symptoms, unfortunately, the first symptom that we see is usually dead cattle. So, and that's exactly what we're trying to prevent is that acute death. Really, we're going to monitor the water sources and try to visualize if we see a strange algae mat floating across, or it looks like an algae mat, or if we see some of that paint-like consistency on the shores on the downwind side of the pond, that should really raise some red flags that, hey, we need to verify, is this blue-green algae? And if it is, that's when we'll take some pretty drastic steps to protect the rest of the herd.
To verify, what are some steps producers can take?
So to verify if it's blue-green algae and if it has the toxin, there's a couple of quick tests that you can actually do. Some are called the stick test or the jar test. You can ask your local extension agent about some of those tests. But really, it's getting a water sample from a couple of feet away from the bank of what appears to be blue-green algae. If you're going to take a water sample, make sure that you wear gloves because it can actually be irritative even to your skin if you come in contact with it. But really, it's putting it in a water bottle, something cleaned out, but get a fair representative sample, a quart or so, and actually shipping it to the veterinary diagnostic lab here at Kansas State. We have a wonderful toxicology lab, and they're able to, one, confirm if it's cyanobacteria, and they can look at it under the microscope. They can determine if it's there, yes or no, but they can also determine if the toxin is there. So those are the couple of different types of tests that are available to producers because if it does have the toxin, the entire herd, I mean, that it is potentially toxic every time they try to go drink. So that's where we'll really step up our game.
If producers do find that this is something that's in one of their water sources, are there treatments available for treating these cattle that have been affected that are still kind of on the ends here, or is there not?
So unfortunately, there is no antidote to these toxins, whether the neurotoxin or the hepatotoxin. So since we can't treat it directly, sometimes if we do have surviving animals, they might have diarrhea, they're staggering around. Later stages of liver issues, they can kind of turn yellow, jaundice or icteric, can even get photosensitive. So we'll see sunburns on their nose and things like that, where it'll start peeling off. So it's really supportive care at that point. So for some of the surviving animals, it depends on how much they consume, how big a damage it is, but it's really kind of supportive care.
And because there's not a lot of treatment options, is there a way to prevent this from happening?
Yeah, so it's really trying to prevent exposure. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of options. There's a lot of folks trying to, not just here in Kansas, but really nationwide and worldwide, trying to get a better handle on blue-green algae. How do we control the blooms? How do we treat, that area? And it's challenging. So there's not a perfect answer or a silver bullet to be able to combat this issue. The number one thing that producers should keep in mind is if you have it, we have to reduce access to whatever source that is. If it's a pond, that means we may have to fence off that pond and reduce access so our cattle actually don't go and drink out of that pond. So alternative water sources. It's not fun. It's labor intensive, whether we have to haul water. Sometimes we might have access to a well or might have to pipe in some water, on top of the ground from another water tank. So sometimes it's thinking outside of the box to be able to provide enough water for those grazing animals and those grazing opportunities. The other big thing is maybe an investment long term where we can improve our water sources and maybe have actually a submerged pump. Since the blue-green algae floats on the top of the water, if we are actually pumping water from the bottom of the pond or much lower in the pond where it's cooler, don't have the risk of the blue-green algae or the toxins, that we can actually pump that or have a gravity feed pipe into a different type of tank. So whether it's a water trough, a water tank, but we can get more of that safe water even if it's a contaminated body. That will reduce the risk. The risk is never zero, but it greatly reduces the risk of exposure. That's the key of trying to prevent these things.
Excellent. So definitely some options for producers that are still wanting to utilize those water reservoirs for sure.
And those are some options. Years ago, folks would use copper sulfate to try to kill it. There are some concerns with the use of copper sulfate, both for the other vegetation that's in the pond that should be there, potential damage to some of the fish species that might be in there, but also the copper never really goes away, so it can actually build up at the bottom of the pond that can increase risk of issues in the future. But the key risk is if we kill all the blue-green algae, whenever the algae dies, that cyanobacteria dies, dries, it releases the toxins. So soon after using something like a herbicide like copper sulfate, the pond would even be more toxic for a period of time for at least a couple of weeks.
Wow. Okay. So definitely not something you want to explore experimentally. As far as you've already mentioned testing, but if people are looking for more information, more resources in terms of blue-green algae, where can they find that at?
So KDHE, Health and Environment through Kansas, their harmful algae bloom map. It's an interactive map where it's updated every single day to see if there's any warnings or hazards for blue-green algae in different areas of the state. Currently, here on the eastern side of the state, we have several warnings that are out. So monitoring those maps, keep being cognizant on when those pop up. While every producer may not be testing regularly or doing it through the season, some of those reservoirs are kind of key indicators when the conditions are right. So, for example, if one of your local reservoir all of a sudden has a harmful algae bloom warning, hey, maybe we need to start checking a little bit closer in some of our pasture-based systems, making sure we don't, because we should have this, similar weather, similar sunshine, making sure that they aren't popping up.
Thank you, AJ, for bringing awareness today to blue-green algae blooms and the negative effects that they can have on cattle, as well as letting producers know what resources are really out there and made available for them to utilize, especially the regularly updated harmful algae bloom maps. The most recently updated map shows current warnings in several counties. Those counties are as follow and includes Salina, Marion, Sedgwick, Geary, Shawnee, and Wyandotte County. A link to that important source can be found in the show notes of today's show, and those show notes are located on our website, which is agtoday.net. That was AJ Tarpoff, K-State Beef Extension veterinarian, on blue-green algae blooms. We'll be back once more again here shortly with more on Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today. We have with us Phillip Lancaster, a beef cattle nutritionist here at K-State. Today we're going to be discussing a product that's somewhat new to the market and may be of interest for some producers in the state just because it has to do specifically with being fed in feedlots.
Yes, so there's a new product out called Blue-Green that is labeled to reduce ammonia emissions from feedlots.
What are some things that producers specifically should know about this product?
Well, a couple of things are that it's not labeled for improvement in animal weight gain or feed efficiency or any animal performance metrics. It is specifically labeled for reducing ammonia emissions and that alone. There are some studies that point to improvements in weight gain and carcass weight and feed efficiency, but not all studies do. And so it is not labeled for that. Another thing that producers should know that it is a beta agonist / antagonist, and so it works in somewhat of a similar way as the products ractopamine and zolpadrol in that it boosts lean growth through those mechanisms. And so the question for producers that they're going to be interested, can I feed this product along with those other products? And right now the company is saying no. Pretty good reason, because you're going to be using one of those other products, ractopamine or zolpadrol, that are agonists, or they stimulate the beta receptors. And then this product is an antagonist that shuts down those receptors. And so basically you would negate the effect of both products and get no benefits whatsoever.
Sure, and because of that, this product's being called a
beta modulator. Yeah, so it's an antagonist for the beta 1 and beta 2 receptors, which ractopamine and zolpadrol are agonists for, and that's why they cancel each other out. But then this product is an agonist for the beta 3 receptor. That's where it's exerting its effect.
Walking through kind of the label of this product, what are some of the key things that producers should know?
Well, a couple of key things that are on the label. It is a medicated article, and so you have to follow the normal mixing instructions for mixing a medicated type C complete feed. The label indications are that it should be fed between 1.25 to 4.5 grams per ton of complete feed, and in that way you're providing between 13 and 90 milligrams of Blue-Green per head per day. And that's recommended to feed for the last 14 to 91 days of the feeding period. And that's a pretty big range compared to what we see for the other beta agonist type products. The data that I've seen, feeding for a longer period of time has a greater reduction in ammonia emissions, and if there's going to be any, is a greater improvement in animal performance.
Sure. And then in terms of withdrawal periods, what should producers know about this product?
There is no withdrawal period on this product, so it's similar to the ractopamine beta agonist product, that there is no withdrawal period. So that makes it a little easier for producers when they're marketing cattle, that they don't have to time that right.
And then in terms of producers that are looking into or maybe considering feeding this product, if they're looking for the result aspect of this, what can they anticipate result-wise from this product?
Yeah. So they should be able to anticipate lower ammonia emissions. They should have less issues with air quality violations or anything like that, those types of things. They should not necessarily expect improvements in animal performance, although they may see some.
So in terms of the importance of this product, or maybe the role that it can kind of play as we see the beef industry evolve as time goes on, why ammonia specifically do you think that this product could be of use?
So I think that the company targeted ammonia emissions from the aspect that it is the largest air quality problem from beef cattle feedlots. And the issue is that ammonia is volatilized off the pen surface from manure and urine, and it forms the particulate matter in the air, in the atmosphere, which then can travel to different places through wind currents and things like that, and can be deposited back into water bodies through precipitation. And so that then changes the plant communities and the animal species communities in that ecosystem. Even though feedlots are primarily in the center of the country, those ammonia emissions from those feedlots can be impacting ecosystems to the east and in the eastern part of the country.
So, Phillip, in terms of some concluding remarks here, where do you believe the future of products of this sort of nature might lie?
I mean, I think they're going to be used. I think from a beef industry perspective and consumer perception, that what we do to improve our environmental impact or reduce our environmental impact is going to be looked upon very favorably. The interesting thing is that the way this product works, there's already a couple other products on the market that would do the same thing, except they don't have this label claim of reducing ammonia emissions. And so that's the big difference, I think, in my mind.
That was Phillip Lancaster covering what producers need to know about a new feeding additive on the market for the reduction of specifically ammonia gases. Phillip is also involved with the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chats podcast, and they recently discussed feeding minerals and vitamins to cattle and some considerations for feeding those in the summer months.
All of us face the decision of you go to get mineral and it gets pretty expensive. And so there are times that you say, well, how much of this do I really need? And when they're out grazing that nice, lush green grass at this time of year, you say, do I still need to have them on a mineral supplement? Are they getting what they need from the grass, or do I at least need to change it? What are your thoughts on supplementation, especially as we think about summer?
There are probably three different things to be brought up in regards to that. You mentioned trace minerals, you mentioned vitamins, but also, some of the macro minerals are impacted certainly by region and geography as well. We talk about the antagonists that are in the environment from things like water and also in some of the forages, things like sulfur and iron and molybdenum. Those certainly impact the level of copper that producers interested in feeding. And also, I think the macro mineral requirements can be quite a bit different. I think as you look at the United States, and we deal with customers from the East Coast to the West Coast, really very different formulations, particularly in terms of calcium and phosphorus that we need to look at. I think phosphorus is one that's particularly interesting this year as the cost of phosphorus has really climbed and increased. People are more interested in making sure that's in tune. But a lot of times producers are inconsistent mineral feeders, and so we also need to consider, are we playing catch up? Are we in a good spot?
We're inconsistent mineral feeders, and the cows are inconsistent mineral eaters. What is this? 2 ounce per head per day? I've told them.
They won't necessarily do it. Well, one of the since we've got Tyler here and Phillip both, but we've kind of moved past the time we talk about high magnesium mineral. And again, I'm sure there's some geographic areas, but we're probably moving away from our high mag mineral into kind of our summer mineral. But yeah, intake is important and important to monitor. And I liked your comment, Tyler, about phosphorus, because my opinion is that there's some phosphorus. There's some soils and plants that are probably sufficient in phosphorus and cows on that land don't need a lot of supplementation. So there's some opportunity to save money as phosphorus prices go higher. But on the other hand, there's a lot of areas where phosphorus is deficient, and that's one of the things I really don't want to shave pennies. Got to know your forages and your area.
Well, how do I know?
Well, a lot of times the good thing is things like soil phosphorus. Now, plant digestibility can affect the phosphorus intake, but my soil doesn't change. So if I'm in an area where soil is and the plants are usually sufficient, the only thing I have to worry about is digestibility of the forage. That's why I hate to tell, it's like, well, know your forages. So that's talk to your extension people, talk to the forage agronomist specialist, get some information about your area as your baseline, and then have some year-to-year fluctuation.
Phillip or Brian, would I see anything if I was deficient? So if I wasn't getting enough mineral to them, are there signs that I would see?
I guess it depends a lot on which mineral nutrient you're talking about, right? Some of them are very subtle signs that you wouldn't see anything other than maybe a little bit or maybe a lot of reduced performance. And that can show up as gaining as well, not regaining weight after the breeding season in the cows, or it could be reproductive performance. So it really depends on what the deficiency is. But the other end of that spectrum is toxicities, right? And so we can get in situations where we over supplement. And again, the signs of that depend on what the nutrient toxicity is, but it can be range from, I'm seeing clinical signs of disease to just subtle reductions in performance.
One thing to think about too is as we're going through the summer, the mineral content of that forage changes as it matures and goes through the summer. Even if it's grown on the same soil, the highest mineral content's usually this early spring season, early summer when we got lush green growing forage, and then it starts to decline for lots of minerals. And as Bob said, a lot of those minerals get tied up in what we call the plant cell wall, which is the least digestible fraction of the forage. And so even though the content is there, the availability of that mineral may be lower than what the content would let us to believe. We need to think about those kind of things and pay attention to mineral intake throughout the summer, because it's going to change and vary a lot from this time of year to late summer to fall.
I think that's a great point. And the availability and the consumption, right? They don't like to eat the stemmy stuff, which is where that's going to be tied up. And so even if you tested it, depending on how you test it. But I would make sure that you have a plan, then monitor that plan. Bob, your point excellent on monitoring consumption as you go through.
That was the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. If you are interested in tuning into their program a bit more, you can find their podcast on the KSU BCI website. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
You're listening to Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. Composting is the use of organic material to amend soil. In Kansas, it's used to improve our clay soils. In part 2 of this week's series on composting, K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Johnson County, Dennis Patton, says one of the biggest challenges for most people is determining how much greens and browns to add to the compost pile.
What we're really wanting is kind of a mix of things that are greens that have moisture and nitrogen in them, and then the browns we normally think of being dry and being a carbon source, and probably need roughly about 2/3 carbon, 2/3 brown to 1/3 greens. But the problem with most people in composting is that they have a lot of browns. They have the dry plant materials, they have the shredded leaves, and so then the challenge comes in, where do we get our sources of greens? And that's where you can bring in, if you have some manure-based fertilizers, happen to be on a farm, those type of things, or you can use some garden fertilizer. You can then add some nitrogen to that mix so the compost pile will function and work. Composting is really all about being alive. And what do things that are alive need? They need food, water, and shelter. And so the compost bin pile itself would be the shelter. Moisture is also very important. And then that food source is the carbon, the browns, and the greens that feed the microorganisms that then break down the debris itself.
And we're actually building some heat with all of this process, right?
Yes. So if the compost pile is properly constructed, you've hit that kind of magic combination of greens and browns. After you build the pile, probably within a week to 10 days, that internal part of that pile should be reaching maybe up to 140 degrees or more. I mean, if you stuck your hand into a functioning compost pile, you would feel the heat. So that tells you the compost pile is functioning when you get that spike in that temperature. When you're building that pile, the other thing we want to add or make sure we have in there, besides a nice combination of greens and browns, is that moisture, that water component. Because really, for a compost pile to function at its peak, you probably need that material in that pile to feel more like a damp sponge. So you really need that moisture throughout the entire composting process. If your system's working properly, when it heats up and then starts to cool down, that's when you turn the pile to kind of mix up that material. And then when you turn it, that distributes the fresh material for the organisms to break down. It gives you a chance to add more water, and then you should get another spike in temperature. So that's kind of what we call the compost cycle or the turning cycle. And eventually then, if you're an active composter, that's when you get that compost, in months instead of a year.
Maybe the big question is, how effective is this as being used in the garden, and what are some of the primary benefits of composting?
So the reason we want to kind of go to all this work to create compost is because it's that rich organic matter that is the end product. So if you fill up a big compost bin, kind of the standard size is 4x4x4, somewhere in that ballpark, you're probably only get about a third of that pile back in the organic matter compost itself. And what organic matter has the ability to do is basically unlock the extreme hold all the clay particles in our soils have. So if you go into our typical soils, you put a shovel in, you turn it over, it just kind of clumps in a big clod. So what organic matter compost does is release that kind of hold those clay particles in the soil have on each other. So you get that more rich, loamy type soil. If you ever, watch gardening programs, something like that, they put the shovel in and it just kind of comes out and kind of flakes apart. That's what organic matter compost does. It breaks down the clay, makes it more manageable. It also has the ability to add more water holding capacity to the soil, as well as aeration, making a more hospitable growing zone for roots of our plants. And of course, if we have healthy roots, we're going to have healthier tops of our plants.
That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Johnson County, Dennis Patton. To learn more about composting, visit www.bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu or contact your local extension office. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. Thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today.